Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Figured I would deal with the FRQs now. Again, Chapter 1 here, FRQ 1. It says for 1A, describe the political institution that Dickinson wants to maintain. The correct answer here is a monarchy. What he's describing in that passage is a monarchy. Letter B, in the context of the passage, explain how the political institution identified in Part A affected the behavior of the colonists. All kinds of things that you could identify here. I got what I wrote down. Um, it says an explanation of how the monarchy and colonial relationship affected the behavior of the colonists. Explanations might include giving the colonists an opportunity to practice self-rule, but also denying them the rights to basic to self-rule. The cooperation between king and parliament to tax the colonists in an unprecedented way caused the colonists to refuse to pay and to organize to protest the new taxes, after which the British government violated additional liberties. Colonist behavior grew increasingly frustrated to the point of declaring independence. So just like the idea of no taxation without, without representation. You just would have to reference something, again, that was going on in history at that time of what the British government was doing to the colonists and like how they reacted. That's what you'd have to identify for Part B. For Part C, explain how the passage relates to representative democracy. And what I have here, explanations of how the passage relates to representative democracy may include the points that the variety of opinions and diversity of interest, rather than being left to a monarchy to manage, should all be represented in a government in which people are the source of the power. So, again, you just would have to identify primarily like what representative democracy is and how that would be an advantage compared to what was being described there by that William Dickinson in that paragraph. So. Basically, for that FRQ, A, B, and C would each be worth 1 point each, so it would be worth a total of 3 points for that question. Jumping over to question 2, it gives you a table, and it has on here results of early presidential elections, and it has the election years of 1792, 96, 1800, and 1804, and it says 2A, describe the information conveyed in the table. And basically it says here, students might describe the information in the table as the results of early U.S. presidential elections by year, candidates, party, and electoral votes. For Part B, describe a trend in the information. Possible answers. It says students might note the trend that in the first 2 elections, Federalists had a sizable lead over the other parties. With the election of 1800, they lost to the Democratic Republicans by a relatively small margin, but lost in 1804 in a landslide. Or, you might point out, the early elections showed both unified and divided electoral college votes, suggesting ongoing concerns about the new federal system. Other trends might include victors winning by varying margins, different numbers of candidates running, and the growth in the number of electoral votes and electors as the years went on. So, option C, draw a conclusion about the reasons for the trend related to people's views on policies of the Federalist Party. One possible conclusion for that trend based on the people's views of the Federalist policies is that with the nation firmly established, people sought to limit its growth and supported policies that protected state and individual liberties. That's what the Democratic Republicans wanted. A possible conclusion about the rising number of electoral votes and electors is that there was a growth in population. And option D, explain how the information in the table demonstrates a difference between the U.S. Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. And it says here that you might want to point out that the Articles did not call for an executive to be elected. Instead, a president was appointed for a 1-year term. In the Constitution, the states played a formal role in selecting the president, so each state had a voice with the Electoral College. So that was FRQ 2. FRQ 3 is the Supreme Court case comparison question. And what it says here, this one they don't really give you a case because in Chapter 1 we really hadn't studied any cases yet, but they did give you a question regardless. And it says option A, identify one constitutional trait of the federal judicial branch or the Supreme Court designed to ensure the judicial branch's independence. And hopefully you know from this one. We know the president appoints the judges. They're not elected, so they're not hampered by public opinion. And basically, they keep their position in the Supreme Court, obviously, for life, unless they get impeached or they quit or resign. So that would be a good answer for A. For part B, explain one constitutional procedure or principle designed to counter a federal court or balance the judicial branch's power among the three branches. And basically, you're looking for like a check and balance here kind of thing. So what's a constitutional procedure or principle designed to counter the federal court? Here you probably would want to mention, again, that like Congress can confirm a justice that's nominated, or they can deny. The idea that the president can nominate a judge, can choose them or not. Those would be ways that they could counter. And option C, describe Supreme Court opinions generally and impact they have. You would probably want to mention here like the idea of judicial review, and again that and they can declare something unconstitutional, and just the idea too that what the Supreme Court says is supposed to be the final straw, the final decision. There's nothing higher than the Supreme Court. But what we've also studied is just because they make a decision, what else has to happen? Remember, they need help enforcing the decision. So like the executive branch has to help enforce whatever has been decided by the court. So number 4, I'm not really going to deal with at this point unless we find out on Friday that you need to do a type 4 for this year's exam for the argumentative essay. I'll hold off on that right now just to save some time. But again, if we find out on April 3rd that they're going to do an argumentative essay, we'll come back and revisit this one. So I'm going to jump to Chapter 2's FRQs. And question 1 has a passage from President Ronald Reagan from 1981, his first inaugural address. Option A says, describe the political institution that Reagan identifies as the problem. It looks like he's specifically talking about the national government, kind of like this elite model with elected officials. And primarily he's focusing on the idea of like Congress and the executive branch. Letter B, in the context of the scenario, explain how the power of the institution described in Part A can be affected by its interaction with the U.S. Supreme Court. Here's again where you'd want to talk about like checks and balances, and you probably would want to mention like judicial review. That again, like the Supreme Court could declare something that the other branches had done as unconstitutional, then it would be like basically canceled out. So, and just the idea that then the Congress wants to make sure that they pass laws that are constitutional so that they're not canceled by the Supreme Court. And again, the president wants to act in a way that's deemed to be constitutional, so he's not canceled out. And an example of that would be kind of like the idea of like U.S. versus Lopez, and how the national government tried to restrict gun usage or gun possession in schools, and the Supreme Court stepped in and says, no, that's not a interstate commerce issue, that's not a national government issue, that's left to the states. So, letter C, in the context of the excerpt, explain actions that the public can take to influence the political institution described in Part A. Just the idea that people can go out and join interest groups to try to influence Congress to pass certain laws or a certain way. Another way, too, here, a big way, is that if you don't like what the government's doing, you can vote for or against the officials. So if you don't like what a certain president is doing or a certain representative or senator is doing, you could vote them out in the next election. The next question, number 2, it says, use the information graphic above to answer the following questions. And the chart here has the Department of Transportation grant accounts, fiscal year 2016, in millions of dollars. And it looks like they've got a whole number of things that money was being spent on, different categories. Number 2, letter A, identify how much the Department of Transportation spends. I hope that you get a question this easy on the exam. I doubt they'll give you one this easy. You just have to look at the chart and find the correct number. If you look at the total DOT, Department of Transportation funding, it says at the bottom, 75,003, and again, this is in million. So if you translate that over, it would be basically $75.003 billion was being spent. basically a little over $75 billion. Letter B, describe the difference between the largest and smallest grants. Excuse me. If you look at the top, the Federal Aid Highway Program spent the most at 42 1,671 million, or basically 42.6 billion. The one that spent the least was assistance to small shipyards, which spent basically 5 million. And if you subtract the difference between the two, you get the correct answer, which in this case would again be the 42.666 billion. You just would take the 42,671 figure and subtract the 5 to get you your answer. So you just would subtract the 2, and you would list that you also would want to identify the two programs from the chart, the one that was the biggest and the one that was the smallest when you do that. Letter C, draw a conclusion about this difference. I had just written down that more people use the highway system, which is why they would want to spend more money on that. More people are going to use it than they're going to use for shipyards. So more people are going to use and support the idea of money being spent on highways than they're going to want to spend on shipyards. And then letter D, explain how the Department of Transportation funding demonstrates the principle of federalism. Basically, this is the idea of grants and aid. This is the idea where the national government is giving money to the states for them to then use that money. That's the idea of federalism. It's the national government and the state governments working together. But again, the national government is giving money to the states for them to use for a certain purpose. So, number 3, they are talking about 1996 California legalized medical marijuana. They said the federal government had basically declared it to be illegal because of the Controlled Substance Act. And then they say that California, the people of California basically argued that medical marijuana should be legal in their state, and then the federal government still tried to enforce the Controlled Substance Act and make it illegal in California, even though the California citizens had voted it to be legal. The case went to the Supreme Court, in this case Gonzalez versus, I think it's Raich, and the court ruled 6-3 that the national government did have the authority to prohibit medical marijuana possession in the state of California, even if it was legal there. So, your questions. Letter A, identify the constitutional clause that is common to both Gonzalez versus Raich, 2004, and the United States versus Lopez, 1995. You would have to identify the Commerce Clause, the ability to regulate interstate commerce. Letter B, based on the constitutional clause identified in Part A, explain why the facts of Gonzalez versus Raich led to a different holding than the holding in the United States versus Lopez. Pretty much I think what the main argument here is that in Gonzalez versus Raich, marijuana is a commodity. It's an item that potentially could be sold in between states. So someone that has medical marijuana in California could have bought it from somebody, let's say in Nevada. That's an interstate commerce issue. So they argue the government does have the right, via the Commerce Clause, to regulate something like that, to make it illegal. Whereas United States versus Lopez and gun possession in schools, they basically said that schools are the realm of states. States are the ones that pass laws about schools, and you really couldn't realistically argue that gun possession in schools was an interstate commerce issue. You couldn't go that far. They remember that in that case they tried to argue different things too, that they went as far as to the U.S. government did, that, well, if there's gun possessions in schools, that's going to make people not want to go to those schools and live in that community, which then could hurt the local businesses, which then they had this like really elaborate systems trying to explain why it could regulate or why it could deal with interstate commerce, but the Supreme Court said no, that's too far of a stretch. That's not interstate commerce. Letter C, describe an action that California users of medical marijuana might take to limit the impact of the ruling in Gonzalez versus Raich. And let me look at what it has here. Make sure I find the right one. Number 3. Sorry for the delay. I just want to make sure I have it lined up properly here for you. What they have It says student answers might suggest joining an interest group, working toward the national legalization of marijuana. You could try to pass like a national law that could cancel out that Controlled Substance Act. They also say that you could suggest that you could run for office with a pro-legalization platform. And again, it says in the parentheses here, 1 point would be given for another method that is deemed to be reasonable. So we've dealt with that question enough during the year, where if you get one of like, what could you do, or what could someone do? So again, just try to think of something that's related to the topic, something that's like related to government, that and maybe some vocabulary that we've talked about in class that you could tie into that question as far as what you could do. Interest groups are always a good answer. Help pass a law that would counter whatever it is that was said. Just think back to the things that we've talked about. So anyway, that's primarily what I have for you today. I'm going to send out the unit review packet for Unit 2 to you today. You're going to be focused on Unit 2 this week. Unit 2 is going to consist of chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. So 3 was the legislative branch, 4 the executive, 5 the bureaucracy, and 6 the judicial branch. So work on that review guide. I would also like you to try to work on and do the FRQs again, at least the first 3, for each of those 4 chapters. Okay? I will send out an email on Friday once they find out what they talk about for what they say for the AP exam. And other than that, just keep on working, keep on preparing. Hopefully you're still planning to take the exam. I'm hoping everybody that signed up to take it still is going to plan to take it. Again, it's going to be different this year. So anyways, enjoy the rest of your week. Be working on that review guide for Unit 2. Do it to the best of your ability, because remember, again, you likely will be able to use it when you take the exam. And I will talk to you later. Stay safe, everybody.